Hello students, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture videos on Chapter 8, the Progressive Era. So we left off last time talking about muckrakers and the fact that muckrakers wrote about the bad things in society. We're now going to go through a list of some of the more prominent ones. We're going to start with Lincoln Steffens, which was a managing editor of McClure's magazine, and his main focus of his writing was exposing political corruption that occurred during this time, including the political machines. He published a book called The Shame of Cities, exposing political corruption for all to read about. We have Jacob Riis, who wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. This was a groundbreaking book that showed the conditions of the urban poor. Most people living outside the cities in America during this time had no clue that there was such poverty. So in his book, How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Riis wrote about this. He was a photographer for the New York Evening Sun, and his pictures really opened the eyes of Americans to how bad of a problem this was. And if you would, please pause the video and turn to page 215 in your yellow history textbook. You'll read a little excerpt from that. We have Ida Tarbell. Her main goal was to take down John D. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Trust. Ida Tarbell's father had once worked for a refinery that was purchased by John D. Rockefeller, and their refinery went out of business. Her father lost his job, and he became an alcoholic. So Ida Tarbell, the rest of her life, was very, very bitter toward John D. Rockefeller, and when she became older, began writing things against him to try to take him down. And her book, The History of Standard Oil, is basically a smear campaign, smear tactic at trying to tell the world how bad that she felt John D. Rockefeller was. We have Upton Sinclair, which wrote a book called The Jungle. Now, there is an excerpt in your book, in your yellow history textbook, from the book The Jungle, and we're going to read that in class together. But it exposed the harsh conditions of immigrant workers, and it also told about how dirty and unsanitary and unclean our meatpacking industry was. And this book single-handedly led to many laws being passed to help make our food and our medicine safer in this country. And again, we'll read a part of that book in class. Now, we're moving to some more progressive reforms here. The progressives, part of them had a belief in what was known as the social gospel. The social gospel basically said that by following the Bible's teachings about charity and justice, we can fix all of our social problems. Now, this led to the development of what were called settlement houses. Settlement houses were community centers that provided social services, and these were free or of very, very little cost. For example, they would teach the poor classes in childcare, they would teach English to immigrants, and they would have nursery schools and kindergartens for parents that had to go off and work. They could leave their children there. The leading figure of this movement of building these settlement houses was Jane Addams. She started what was called Hull House in Chicago, which became the most famous settlement house. And you can kind of compare that today to the YMCA. It's a place you could go for free. You could rest. You could learn things. They had sporting activities. They taught classes. Basically, a service to help the poor. Moving into progressives in education. As I told you earlier in the first video, the progressives wanted to stop child labor. And in 1916, they succeeded by getting the government to pass the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act. And this effectively banned child labor. We also have John Dewey, a very, very important figure in American education. In fact, he's known as the father of the modern American high school. He's known as such because a lot of his ideas that he came up with during his time are still in use today. For example, he wanted schools to teach useful skills such as shop, home ec, and etc. Today, we do the same types of things, only with different types of classes. We have engineering classes, computer classes, and so forth. So John Dewey is very, very influential and important when you talk about American high schools. One of the things the progressives wanted to fix was working conditions, and something happened in 1911 that really woke up the nation and made us realize that working conditions were horrible in certain parts of the country. In March of 1911, a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory killed 146 workers. Most of them were women. Many of these women were chained to their machines, and this was a regular practice to keep workers from walking off and taking breaks. And because they were chained to their machines, they were unable to escape the fire. When the public found out about this, they were outraged, and they pushed for the government to do something about it. So after the progressives started doing these things and making the muckrakers started writing about these problems, the government began to intervene and try to solve some of them. And we'll talk about some of those in the next video. Thank you for watching.